Welcome back to the module on grant budgeting basics. In this next section, we will be tackling direct versus indirect expenses. What are they? How are they different? To begin, we'll look at direct costs. When we talk about direct costs, I'm going to use the definition that comes from the federal government. And if we think about that definition, that is our strictest definition. And so what does that mean? We're looking at a definition from the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR. And so the Code of Federal Regulations is where we find all sorts of restrictions on the types of expenses that are incurred by grantees. And so the symbol that's in front of the number 200.413, that indicates that what we're looking at is information that is from the Code of Federal Regulations. The direct costs, as defined by the federal government, are costs that are easily identifiable, specifically with a particular final cost objective, meaning a federal grant, program, or project. Okay, let's try to translate that, shall we? This means basically what are the staff, supplies, equipment, travel costs, etc. that are in your project budget that are directly related to your goals, to your SMART objectives in a grant program. If you did not have these expenses, if you did not pay for these costs, something about the program or project design itself wouldn't happen. That's my interpretation of the formal federal direct cost definition for you. When we look at direct costs, I'm going to show you on the screen here, we have the simplified version of the SF 424 budget forms. These are the federal form family that we see related to all grant budgets. And when we look at the costs, the class categories, does anyone happen to notice how there are way less rows in terms of expense types than in one of our examples we just looked at in grant guidelines? That's interesting. Could it be that they are really less complex at the federal level? The reality is they're deceivingly simple. There's only a very few class categories that are allowed in terms of expenses when it comes to federal grants. And many things that you may break out internally in your operating budget, or another foundation grant maker might break out on their budget form. Nope, they're smushed. There's the professional term for it. They are in fewer class categories if we're at the federal level. But what's important to note in this rather deceivingly simple form is that everything from A through H in our class categories, they sum into our total direct charges. Again, those are the charges that if we did not have those expenses, if we did not pay for those expenses, we would not have a project or program. What does that leave us with then? What is this indirect charge? I'm going to describe that for you in just a moment. And what happens is we will then sum our direct charges and our indirect charges in order to get our total project cost. So now we find ourselves presented with the Code of Federal Regulations definition for indirect costs. Indirect costs are what many will refer to or think of as the way we keep the lights on, that we keep the doors open. These are costs that are incurred over a common or a joint purpose that can't be readily assigned to one project or to one program. What would be some examples? Your human resource colleagues, your IT staff, your CEO or your CFO. Those roles, difficult to say that we are going to assign their time to just one specific project or program, or to take a specific portion of it for a project or program. They are required for the entire organization to operate. So those are the type of roles that will be included in indirect costs. When we look at indirect cost, it's a simple line within the budget form. When we look at that indirect cost rate, there is the possibility for an organization to have a federally approved indirect cost rate. This, well, it's something that's a lot of paperwork, let's be honest. And so many organizations will not go after having a federally approved indirect cost rate until they have a few awards under their belt. But once you have an approved indirect cost rate, this is your go-to percentage. It becomes a very basic calculation. What is our total direct cost? We calculate the percentage of the indirect cost based on our approved rate, and voila. Simple, right? Well, except for that we will often see in grant guidelines something about MTDC, which is Modified Total Direct Costs. Within government grants, there will be definitions for things that must be excluded from your direct costs before you calculate your indirect cost rate. That indirect cost rate and the amount you're going to put in that budget form is incredibly helpful for keeping the lights on and the doors open. So organizations like to be very careful about that calculation so that you don't leave any of that funding on the table. But there's good news for those of you that said, what? Federally approved indirect cost rate? What is that? Do we have one? How do I get one? What do we have to do? There is something that is called the de minimis rate that went into effect in the late 2010s that was really a win for nonprofits of all shapes and sizes. What it means is that any grant-seeking organization that is not a federal entity may claim the de minimis rate, may claim 10% as their indirect cost rate without going through the paperwork to get a federally approved indirect cost rate. Huge win. What it means is that once you calculate your direct cost or your modified direct cost if required, then you apply your 10% indirect cost and you fill that number into your budget form. You can, as an organization, use the de minimis rate forever. There's no time limit on using this rate. You don't have to use it only for your first 1 or 2 federal awards and then move on to the more complicated version. No, not the case. Rather, you are eligible to use the de minimis rate for all of your federal applications for the foreseeable future. This is great news because now, all right, it might not be your full indirect rate as your CPA for your organization might calculate, but at least you are going to have some way to recoup some of those lights on, doors open type costs. When we think about this modified total direct cost, I want to give you just a little bit of knowledge so that if it comes up in the guidelines that you're reading, you're in one of those sets of guidelines that's dozens of pages long and you get to the budget section and it's talking about modified total direct cost. Well, the first thing to do is get on email or on the phone with your colleagues over in finance, because this is going to be a highly collaborative process. If we're in a big government application where we're talking direct versus indirect in terms of our costs, and we're talking about modified total direct costs, absolutely. Set a time to go over this together. Set up your meetings so that we can figure out what are we going to have to remove to get to the modified total direct cost. The most likely thing that will affect this is if you have subawardees or subcontracts. That's the first place that you want to look. That way we're calculating this number together and we can move on with completing our form. Now, for those of you that said, okay, we don't have a federally approved indirect cost rate, I understand that we can use de minimis, that 10% for our indirect cost rate, and we can use that for as long as we want. But you can apply if you have received a federal award. So here's what that means. If you have never received a federal award before as an organization, you can't yet apply for an indirect cost rate. There is zero pressure, there's no ability even for you to do it. So de minimis, the 10%, is going to be your friend. If, however, your organization has received at least one federal grant award, then you may, should you choose, apply for an indirect cost rate. What you need to be aware of is who is your cognizant agency. That means which agency is going to review your paperwork and approve an indirect cost rate. This is most likely, most of the time, the agency at the federal level from whom you receive the most federal funding. There are some exceptions, but most of the time it is the federal agency that you get most of your funding from. This is a slow process. This is a heavily documented process. This is another instance where you will be talking with your colleagues in finance extensively. You probably want to have if your organization is audited, it's probably a good thing to get the CPA invested in this process early on as well. But no pressure. As I said earlier, you do not have to do this. The de minimis rate, that 10%, is there, accessible, and honestly, ready for you to use it at any time. When we think about direct and indirect expenses, the class categories in the government budget forms often look deceivingly simple. The majority of those line items are your direct costs, the things that it takes to implement the project or program. The indirect cost line, two options: claim the de minimis 10% or have a federally approved indirect cost rate, and then you will apply that percentage and calculate the number accordingly. I know that sounds overly simple when I say it that way, which is why I want to make sure you know if you have any questions when you look at these budget forms, when you're meeting with finance, talking about direct versus indirect, please feel free to email me, Diane at dhleonardconsulting.com. I'm here to answer questions at any time. Well, we're still making our way through our budget fun when it comes to grant budgets, so I look forward to seeing you in the next section of this module.